Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we will continue our exploration of the culture or the cultures of consciousness. I had a great opportunity when I did my book, The Visionary State, A Journey Through California's Spiritual Landscape, of visiting dozens and dozens of spiritual centers, ashrams, temples, churches, retreat centers, sacred sites throughout California. And people often ask me what my favorite one was, and while there are a number that were quite startling and transformative, I'd have to say that my favorite place, at least one that was still operative as a spiritual or religious institute, was the Kali Mandir, which is a lovely little Kali temple in Laguna Beach. And, folks, if they know much about Kali at all, will probably think of her classic fierce imagery, which these days is plastered on T-shirts and lunch boxes and cards, as well as more traditional religious iconography. And you see this blue woman with a red tongue thrust out with a garland of skulls and chopped off arms around her waist, holding bloody swords and straddling sometimes upon the seemingly dead or at least deeply spaced out body of another god or another human. Often very fierce imagery. And yet the Kali figure at this Kali Mandir is a very sweet, powerful, loving presence despite the vibration of fierceness beneath it. That's partly because the folks behind the temple are fairly focused on what you might think of as the right-hand approach to Kali, emphasizing her more maternal and devotional or excessively devotional side, as opposed to a fiercer left-hand version. But even these distinctions become a little clearer. But I'm very fascinated by Kali in particular as a Hindu deity, a set of ideas, a set of images, of experiences, of techniques of worship that is in some ways about as alien from Western religious ideas as you can, to have a goddess that looks as much like a monster out of a horror movie as she does what we traditionally think of as a goddess, as a powerful spiritual force. And it seems to me that in understanding her and understanding how she has entered into the Western stream, we get to grapple a little bit more directly with some of the issues that are raised by what these gods are. What are they doing in people's lives? How do people in the West approach deities and practices from very different cultures, and how are those gods or the forms of worship changing in our modern world? And so I've always been interested in seeing particularly how Kali shows her face today. And with that in mind, I'd like to bring on our guest, who is a priestess who has been initiated in traditional streams of Kali worship and practice in India, but is also a Wiccan priestess and a longtime practitioner of more pagan paths. Her name is Chandra Alexandre, and she's the founder of Sharanya, which is a spiritual group and cultural mission centered in the Bay Area. So, Chandra, thanks so much for being on Expanding Mind.
Thanks for having me so much, Erik. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's really great. So, I'm just curious. I mean, I always like to start let people start off kind of talking a little bit about where they've come from and how they've arrived at the topic of the day. And I'm curious, when in your own development did you become interested in Tantra and Kali worship in the Hindu mysteries in terms of your own spiritual or intellectual growth?
Well, spiritually in about 92, and intellectually probably a little bit after, in about, I would say, 95 or 96, when I started my graduate work. And there's an echo on the phone. I don't know if you guys can hear it.
Sounds okay to me.
It does? Okay. I'll deal with it. So in 92, I had a dream, and Kali came to me in a dream, and it was at that moment that I was awakened from a rather eclectic general pagan spirituality that I had sort of come to over the years into a much more focused, questioning, interiorly seeking something kind of spirituality that eventually led me into and through an intellectual exploration to India and Ma's homeland, which is where I came to devote myself, as I had never done before, to a particular spiritual pathway, a particular way of understanding the divine, and of course the actual culmination in dedication to Goddess Kali. So that's a very brief overview of my pathway. But combining both the academic and spiritual certainly was, two veins of a stream coming together that has led me to, upon coming back from India in 98, the formation of Sharanya and the cultivation of...
Seems like we have just lost her, so I'll fill in a bit as we chase Chandra down. It's interesting to note as well, like coming from an eclectic background and shifting into a more specific and focused worship is a very interesting pattern, since a lot of spiritual seekers these days, and particularly those drawn to pagan paths, wind up with a very eclectic approach, where it's very obvious that in many ways we're kind of making this up as we go along, and there's a lot of longing even, or kind of curiosity about what it would be to be more linked to a direct traditional current, and so the move between a pagan mixture and a specifically focused God form is a really rich move. So, Chandra, I think we have you back now.
Yeah, I'm here. I actually could hear you.
That's weird. We lost you. So you that was kind of must have been sort of a ghostly experience there. But again, that seemed to be. Can you talk a little bit about before you had this dream and before you were drawn into this very powerful and traditional current of practice, a little bit about how it felt with this more eclectic background, and did you have a sense that there was something missing, or was it just that it was time to follow the goddess in a particular path?
Sure. No, I want to just touch on the traditional element of what you just said, and the fact is that the Shakta Tantra, while is something very well established and has a tradition in India, it's by no means traditional. Shakta Tantra is still marginal. It's still very much looked down upon by the Orthodox Hindu in general, and in that way is not at all traditional. So I just wanted to mention that. But in terms of my own development, I think that it wasn't just about I wanted to find a particular form of deity. Often people talk about looking for a matron in the pagan traditions or something to that effect, and that wasn't at all my story. I was very happy being an eclectic witch. I had not particularly followed Wicca, but had followed a more general pathway that incorporated some teachings from, you can say, the old country that my grandmother had invested in me growing up as a child, with sort of the more spiritual environment of pagans in New York City, which is where I'm from. But it was at a time in my life where my personal development started awakening to psychological and psychospiritual potentials, and I think it was just a critical coming together of personal inquiry with spirituality, and this dream for me was an awakening. My travels and subsequent study in India, as well as in combination with graduate work, really brought me to understand that spirituality wasn't just about something out there. It was very much about my own personal growth, development, and yes, of course, relationship to the divine, but ultimately that question, what is the divine and what is it that I'm talking about and working with, and what is this energy and consciousness? And that exploration led me to a realization that brought together really all of who I was, inner, outer, political, spiritual, academic, you name it, and that became focused through devotion to Kali Ma. So I hope that answers a little bit of your question.
Sure. I'd love to ask you a little bit about your dream, not so much to go into the details if you don't care to, but I'm sure as someone who's been participating in spiritual currents and synchronicities and images and emotions around these things for it sounds like your whole life. If you had a connection with your grandmother, then I'm no doubt you've had many remarkable dreams. Most of us have had remarkable dreams, even seeing encountering certain kinds of figures. What was it about this dream that seemed to signify something more important, that this was really indicating an opening or a shift or an opportunity that was beyond even other kinds of dreams that we might have? What made it a call as well as a dream?
Well, it's the only dream I've ever had in my whole life where I woke up terrified, and I woke up in a cold sweat, and I woke up upright in bed. This is not something that has ever happened to me before, and knock wood, probably I hope won't happen again. It was very much a shattering. And these kinds of dreams and these kinds of experiences, as you well know, are initiatory. As you said, they're sort of an opening. So what it was, that's sort of the somatic level, right? But what this dream was the way I like to speak of it is as a wake-up call. It was very simply an image of Kali Ma, black-skinned, fierce. You can think from the mythology, battle-ready, all accoutrements, just a gaze, a staring, a figure larger than life in the realm of my vision in the dream. And that's all I saw. But it wasn't only this image, it was the connection very deeply to everything that I believed, every sense of who I was, every, notion of ego and attachment. And I didn't sort of have this language for it then, but it scared the what out of me at the time. And it was, again, visceral. So if I were to say today that opening, that shattering, was a real call to the depths of my soul. Chandra, do you want to live or die? If you choose life, you had better start living another way. And that would be my encapsulation of Kali's message to me in that dream. And she was the beacon. She was the guide. She was the one, through that image, through that intensity, who could come to me and say, girl, you have to do something different because what you're doing is really not leading down the road to prosperity, health, and well-being.
Right. What do you think was in you that could recognize that even a very terrifying, almost encounter with death in a dream is a sign to move forward rather than to go, whoa, I had a terrible nightmare. I must do a banishing ritual against this scary creature that came in and scared my socks off. I mean, that would be another kind of reaction that somebody would have to an initiatory dream. And I ask that partly because I'm fascinated by dark, challenging, terrifying, nightmarish dreams, because in my experience and the experience of people that I've talked to about following this up, there is a powerful and specifically initiatory current to some of our more terrifying dreams. But in our culture, even in our spiritual culture to some degree, there's kind of a resistance to the possibility that such upsetting, frightening experiences are actually signs that you should be moving forward in some way in assimilating and moving through that. those difficulties rather than shrinking away from some kind of demonic or dark energy?
Well, I don't know that I have a complete answer to your question, as in that moment, what was I thinking? I can say that I had enough wherewithal to know that I should take a pause and that I shouldn't do anything right away. I spent probably a good amount of time just digesting the experience and coming out of the experience. But it wasn't too long after that dream that I began relating it to some of the facts of my life. I had begun some psychological exploration with a Jungian analyst and was, I think, starting to put some pieces together, trying to heal myself from anorexia, trying to heal the psychology that had led to that disorder and addiction. And it was a time where I had been engaging in various cultural mythologies and was aware of the Sumerian descent of Inanna myth. And I think that putting some of those different pieces together helped me to see that this was another way you could say that I was, as Inanna perhaps descending to visit Ereshkigal in the underworld, given an opportunity to be reborn. And the question of how I wanted to live my life from that point forward gradually, again, this is many, many years later, but gradually started to emerge, and I was able to embrace the dream in a very different way. But no, I had actually never thought of the banishing component, and you're absolutely right. Of course, that's another road certainly I or anyone else could go down, but that wasn't how I was left in the dream. I was left with a very clear sense of expansiveness rather than of closing down, and I think that feeling, combined with everything else I've just mentioned, probably is what let me sit with it and let the dream sort of melt into my body and beingness. And from that place, I could, begin to take baby steps forward.
So I'm curious about those further steps. When you went to India, or I'm sure many times you've been to India, but initially when you first started to go, were you looking for initiation? Were you looking for a direct contact with practitioners, or were you just kind of following your nose, sort of just seeing which way things would unfold?
I would say that my soul was looking for an experience, was yearning for some sort of meaning-making out of my life, the experience, and the road that I was traveling spiritually. But no, I went under the auspices of doing my doctoral field work in India in 1998 and was working on the spiritual motivations for women-led grassroots environmental movements in India. So that's why I was there. Sure, there was, a spiritual component to my research, but I wasn't there with a personal agenda per se. Again, I think that was probably the relatively still unconscious what had gotten me there. But that quickly came to the surface, and I was offered an opportunity. The first time I was in India, I was there for 6 months, and I spent a good chunk of that 6 months abandoning the work that I had set out to do and answering the door opens, you're standing at the threshold saying, should I step across? And I took that proverbial 3 days to make a decision, got back on a train, went back down to Puri, which is where I was initiated, and technically converted to Hinduism, and then received the initiation into Shakta Tantra under a priest of Kali. And that answering of the call was really my first concrete step into claiming a new reality.
At that point, how much did your background in paganism and Western neo-paganism, this sort of very eclectic, very modern, in some ways, although reaching back for very ancient sources, but how much did that prepare you or not prepare you for what you were stepping into with this very different kind of initiation?
Symbolically, it usually prepared me. I was very much able to look at otherwise alien ritual context and make sense out of certain things. Certain things felt very familiar to me, and that was very stabilizing and felt very grounding for me. A lot of the work, though, particularly in Tantra, as mantras were being offered and the Sanskrit was being recited, and some of the philosophical philosophical components in which I had absolutely no background started coming up, I was lost. I was absolutely lost. And it took me years and years and years of study, and I continue to study, to become more familiar and adept with those practices, and sort of the integration of, again, the theory, the philosophy with the actual work of living a life devoted to the divine.
So can you tell us a little bit about, I know it's a very complex subject, but about the Shakta tradition that you were initiated in? I mean, again, I think most people will know the image of Kali, will have some sense of Tantra in the most general sense, but it's a very, multi-used term. So what was it about the particular tradition that you've discovered, and in what ways is it not traditional, as you mentioned earlier?
Well, I'll start off with the ways in which it's not traditional, just by analogy, and that is in the West, in the developed world, you don't generally walk around saying, "Oh, I'm a witch." There's a certain still stigma associated with it. There's certain superstition. There's certain stories. There's certain fear, what have you. So it's not, a generally accepted thing. Well, the same is true for tantric practitioners in India. People generally who practice tantra don't go around saying, "Oh, I'm a tantric." Now, that is class-based. It has gender ramifications. There are lots of subtle nuances that, of course, yes, we don't have time to get into, but most generally it's that way in which it's not traditional. An Orthodox Hindu recently said to me, "Well, we thought of you," speaking to me, we Orthodox Hindu Brahmins thought of you Shakta Tantrics as pagans. And she didn't mean it in the nicest way. So, that'll give you a little bit of a sense. But in terms of how I practice it and what it means to be a Shakta Tantric, there are many things Western pagans are already familiar with, this idea, and others as well. People who are familiar with new science understandings of the world and of consciousness certainly have this ancient esoteric tantric core belief in hand, and that is that, everything that I experience, that I have in the gross subtle levels of awareness, of body and mind, everything that is outside is also inside. So as I'm witnessing, experiencing, my senses are taking in, there's another reality that also is the same. And the process of tantric practice and spiritual technologies and techniques that we might do is to really harmonize the inner and outer worlds of experience so that we become able to see reality with a capital R and discern truth with a capital T in ways that are otherwise obscured in day-to-day existence. It's a process, as I like to call it, of encumbering the soul, of allowing the original source of our own creation to shine forth in the world. And Tantra gives us the way, the guiding lights along the path and, the roadmap, as it were, to get to an embodied, engaged spirituality that leads to liberation. You
said encumbering the soul?
Yeah, we unencumber the soul. I mean, our souls are encumbered by, the necessities of what it means to survive. We're born into a world and we quickly adapt to culture and nature and circumstance and family and religion and school and all of these things. And, we have these necessary challenges that at first are there for our survival and then sort of start to encumber us as we mature and grow as individuals, as spirits in the world. And the tantric practices are about removing those layers. We can think of them as the koshas, the veils that encircle the soul, the light of the soul, or we can think of them in any of the ways I've just mentioned. But they're encumbrances nevertheless. And the practices help us both have a sense of introspection and an ability to engage in the world in a way that begins to remove those veils of perception, as William Blake has so lovingly put it. And we can start to, again, harmonize what our inner and outer experiences are so that we come to know the greater substance of truth and reality.
So when you talk about these practices, are you mostly engaged with them in the form in which you receive them, in the sense that you're doing rituals, mantra, devotional practices that you receive more or less whole in whole cloth from the initiations you received, or is it something almost deeper and more subtle that can manifest in different ways, and that part of what you're doing is to kind of creatively find expressions or forms of that work that are more appropriate for you or even for Westerners?
Mm-hmm. Well, both. Certainly in the community work that I do and the work that Sharanya does, what we do is take the practices as they were given to me, these authentic practices, and you could say put them into a more culturally appropriate container and try to devise ways that people here without the background, education, upbringing in Tantra or Hinduism or even a cultural acceptance of Kali in West Bengal and many parts of northeastern India. Of course, Kali is part of the cultural milieu. She's just not confined to Hindus alone. She, of course, spews over the boundaries into other faiths as well. But since we don't have that as background, as substance, as context, what I try and do and what our community tries to do is create a space in which people can be taught and bring the practices. And there's a different kind of richness, I think, that evolves out of that space. So it's both. It's both and. Which means it's evolving, which means it's beautifully in the vein of authentic Shakta Tantra. Wherever Kali goes, wherever goddess goes, borders have never contained her, boundaries have never contained her. She appeared to me, for goodness sakes, in New York City in a dream in 1992, right? How did that happen? But we are evolving Shakta Tantra as it's always done for millennia.
Yeah, do you have a sense of sort of like that you've been empowered because of the connections that you've had in order to make those changes? Is it difficult to know, like, am I playing with things that should be more, should keep a more authentic or traditional form, or do you have a sense that you're in connection with that evolving spirit in a way that allows space for these new experiences and new forms of worship?
I am both deeply grounded in the roots that I have in India and liberated through empowerment from the people with whom I deal in India to find a culturally appropriate expression of Kali worship here in the West.
Great. Well, we're going to take a break right now. I want to talk more about this when we get back. You're listening to Erik Davis. This is Expanding Mind. We're talking to Chandra Alexandre, and we'll be right back after a few messages.
This is PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Hi, this is Karen Hartglass, and I am a vegan. No, I am not an alien from planet Vega. I simply choose to eat plant-based foods. Join me on Ask a Vegan every Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be talking about everything from soup to nuts. Plant-based foods are the healthiest foods to eat, as well as being the most economical, the most compassionate, and the least destructive. If you want to know more about the healthy, planet-friendly, plant-based diet, call in with your questions. Or call in and share your favorite vegan recipes. Tune in on Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on www.progressiveradionetwork.com.
Hi, you're listening to Bhavani, and I'd like to welcome you every Wednesday on the Progressive Radio Network to join me for my show called I Eat Green, where every Wednesday we will talk about eating healthy and eating sustainably for our planet. So join me every Wednesday from 5 to 6.
This is Bill Bowie.
And this is Kelsey Flynn
of Sea Change Radio, covering the shift to sustainability.
We bring you news and interviews
with the likes of Wangari Maathai, Bill McKibben, Hazel Henderson, Paul Hawken, Francis Moore LePay, and many others. Tune in to Sea Change Radio here on the Progressive Radio Network on Saturdays at 7 in the evening.
Sierra Club Radio. Tune in Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern on the ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com to hear interviews with green authors, activists, politicians, celebrities, and more.
Hi, this is Virginia Reed, and I'll see you this Friday talking about Long Day's Journey into Night. We'll have both the director and the main actors, both male and female. This is Virginia Reed. I'm very happy I'm back, and I can't wait to see you all this Friday again on PRN.
This is PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind. This is Erik Davis, and we're talking to Chandra Alexandre about Kali, the craft, and other matters. Chandra, I noticed on your bio page that one of the initiations that you got in India took place at a very fascinating temple or area in Assam at the Kamakya Mandir, which is one of these places I've always longed to go, and I'm sure I will go someday. And during a remarkable festival, and I would just love it if you could tell us a little bit about what's special about that temple and about that festival.
I would be happy to. It's an incredible place. So Kamakya Mandir is a temple situated, as you mentioned, in Assam. It's just outside of the capital city of Guwahati, up on a hill, the Nilachal Hill. And it is the place where, in the myth of Sati and Shiva, if you're familiar with it, the pieces of Devi's body fall to earth. And this is an occurrence that happens because she kills herself after her husband is refused entrance to a great yajna or sacrifice that her father is having, and her husband picks up her body, carries her on his shoulders, and Vishnu, in order to stop Shiva from destroying the world, takes out his chakra or discus, and her body is cut into these 51 pieces. Some say 50, some say 52. In any event, I like 51. And they fall to earth, and Kamakya is where her yoni, or the vulva of the goddess, is said to reside. And it is at that place where there's a confluence of the monsoon waters and the agricultural cycle and the iron oxide-rich soil, and it looks as though from the cleft in the rock that is said to be her yoni in the center of the temple is built around this sacred rock, the water from the spring that runs looks red, and she is said during this time, around June 21st, we are fast approaching the festival, in fact, she's said to menstruate, and so it is a very, very sacred and auspicious time. People come from all over, tantrics, Vaishnavas, it doesn't matter the background. The power of the goddess is said to be so intense and strong that she has healing powers, curative powers, much like the Black Madonnas of Western Europe, who we know for these same kinds of powers. She is said to be able to cure these illnesses and grant special boons and blessings during this time. So the festival is called Ambubachi, and it is this sacred time. The temple is closed for 3 days in order to allow the goddess's menstruation, which happens but this one time a year, to occur. The priests, male priests in this temple, are blindfolded when they are doing the daily preparations and cleaning of the again, it's not an icon or an image, it's just this cleft in a rock that looks like vulva, quite beautiful. You go into the temple and are able to, over a cloth that's placed over it, touch it. So you don't actually look upon it, just as these priests are blindfolded when they have to do the cleansing from all the flowers and vermilion and such and the offerings that are made. But it's an incredibly powerful place. I've gone every year since, I think it's been about 2000, and this year, in fact, with the birth of my daughter, is the first year when I am not going for this festival. So I will be missing it, but we'll have our own Yoni Puja at Sharanya in San Francisco, so it'll somewhat make up for it.
A friend of mine who also went to the festival mentioned that one thing that he noticed was that amidst all of the agoris and sadhus and wizards and all the sorts of characters who would be drawn to this very powerful event, that he noticed an unusually large percentage of women, clearly as very serious, very deep practitioners. Is there some way in which this festival draws that, which has such a powerful, obviously feminine current to it, that it actually sort of constellates some of the female side of intense Hindu tantric practice, which we don't necessarily see quite as much? It's usually the male priests and male sadhus that kind of are more visible.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly true, and just the nature of this festival and the nature of the worship surrounding this tantric goddess, you will find the women coming who otherwise you wouldn't see publicly. That's very, very true. So you have throngs of red wrap tantrikas out visibly where, yes, indeed, because they don't have a formal role in society as priestesses, you're not necessarily going to see them as such. But this festival definitely concentrates, and everyone comes. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of people who come over the course of the 3 days. It is absolutely packed, and the queues are kilometers long in order to get into the temple. I will say that there is an incredible luxury being a moneyed Westerner. Money to the tune of $10 will get you in the quick way. I know it's amazing, but the people generally who come scrape together all year long to be able to receive this darshan, or this sacred blessing of seeing the goddess.
And can you talk a little bit about the agori that you met there and how that relationship evolved? It sounds like such a fascinating event.
It's still fascinating to me, I have to tell you. It's something that lives with me as a current in my life, much as the original dream that sort of instigated all of this was my rebirth, if you will, of Kali did. There are still reverberations of that experience that are things I have no intellectual way of framing as of yet. Maybe I never will. The experience was a tremendous one. I had just received darshan at the temple. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. You get up early and you go for the blessings. And I went off and did some exploring by myself. Now, you have to sort of know that around the temple on this hill, individual teachers, gurus, will set up their own camp, and they'll meet in the same place year after year after year. And so these babas sit, and they will have people come and work with them. They'll do rituals and all of that. So these heterodox rituals are going on while the orthodox rituals are being performed inside the temple. It's a really wonderful confluence of energies in that particular way. So I'm sort of walking around, and I go up the hillside and witness a beautiful homa, a fire ceremony being performed by only men, all white clad, sitting around outside, and I'm behind a fence just watching, and the Sanskrit recitations are beautiful, lyrical, devotional, technically perfect, that kind of a ritual. And so I'm sort of captivated by that for a while, and then I continue. I'm barefoot, by the way. The ground is incredibly muddy. I've mentioned the water and the monsoon and the springs and all of this, but it's this coming together of not only all of the muddiness of the earth and the water, but of course the throngs of people and the urine, and you just continue with your imagination, right? So it can be very dirty. Walking around in this stuff, sort of not really paying mind to where I'm going or heed, and I begin a descent somewhere, and I am called by 2 young black-clad men, probably in their 20s. I notice them because they have on simply these black clothes, a turban, if you will, or a wrap around their head, a small jacket, bare-chested, and a dhoti, or sort of a loincloth kind of thing. And so not speaking with them, but just following their beckoning, I'm curious. I go to where their Baba is sitting, and he is an older man, long gray beard, but looks incredibly youthful in his sort of slight body, and almost pregnant from his sadhana, from his practice and breath work, I would assume. He's got a little round belly from the air work and all of this, the pranayama. So I sit before him, and we have some sort of stilted communication. My Hindi isn't very good. His English is non-existent. We sort of talk ritual language, and so through a mix of Hindi and a bit of Sanskrit, and there's a couple there as well, and the man speaks a little bit, sort of householders. The man speaks a little bit of English, so sort of among that mix of language proficiency, we sort of get by. And it was in that moment that I was chosen to be initiated. So this is not somebody I had spent time studying with. This is not somebody that I knew. This is just a happenstance, a blessing of the goddess, and as I said, an initiatory experience that even sitting here thinking about it, I can feel the energy running through my body. And in part because at this point, my initial initiation into Dakshinachara Tantra in Puri happened in 1998. This initiation took place 5 years later. So I had 5 years of study and learning and doctoral work and integration of previous experiences and practice and sort of increasingly steady footfalls on the tantric path to ground me into sort of what was happening. Now, mind you, it was still scary and it still had its moments where I wasn't sure, if you will, which end was up, but I was much more deeply grounded in awareness of what was going on, which helped enormously. Not fully prepared, but it was in that way that I had a greater context to understand and take in and absorb what that initiation was like.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about how your scholarly work, your intellectual work, it balances your practice. I mean, I know it's a very interesting situation. I mean, you were initially drawn to Tantra or Hindu spirituality partly as an academic, studying other people, and you're doing research, and then you discover your own process unfolding, your own inspiration drawing you deeper in, and yet you're still committed to some of the to your doctorate and to your work there. How do you balance now between a sort of intellectual approach, being aware of history, of being aware of issues of gender, of power, of society, of the globalism, with these extremely powerful, raw experiences, and also ones that rely on that knowledge that you've been accruing?
Well, Tantra as a practice cultivates discernment, and so I would say that it's what comes to mind is, yes, this idea of, balancing it, or of the insider-outsider debate as an academic. How can you or are you as a practitioner sort of marginalizing yourself from the academic discourse because you are, not objective, as it were, right? So all of that. I mean, I bring the discernment, the awareness, the gift of my education to an engagement of community, of practice, and all of that, at the same time that I am deeply committed to, Tantra is a science. I think in the West we tend to think of spiritual practice as something that, it's religion, but in fact, the practice, as I understand it, is very much about morals and ethics and philosophy and all of the ways of living a good and harmonious life that we so desperately want and yearn for. And it's a science in order to achieve that. So I don't know if I anymore use the word balance to try and describe myself. I do consider myself and do act as a presenter at academic conferences and provide papers, but I speak from the place and contextualize myself as I am. I am a Western educated woman with this background and experience, and I just go from there. It's not problematic, I guess I should say. In my mind, it's all about integration. And all about, again, using the faculty of mind and higher mind to bring these qualities of discernment, what I've learned as an academic, into my discipline as a practitioner.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about what we're yearning for, or a lot of us are yearning for in the West. And you've set yourself up very much consciously and creatively as a priestess, as someone who organizes a path, who has people who are looking to you for spiritual guidance, and also with whom you are collaborating in a more, let's say, pagan way on exploring in a democratic fashion to some degree how to craft new mysteries and yet plug into these very powerful ancient currents. How does that, how do you see your role in that sort of work as well, where you're really engaging with people who are also searching, sometimes with as much desperation or more so than you had at the most difficult parts of your own search?
Well, certainly I take the responsibility as a spiritual leader to do the best that I can to help people find their way. I mean, I think that's my job. There's, of course, a certain amount of power, that comes with having community and so on, but that's balanced with the great responsibility that I have to, as the tantric path encourages us, I would say teaches, to live authentically and in harmony with, the world around us. And in order to do that, we have to be incredibly precise, incredibly discerning, thinking about our actions, our thoughts themselves, our speech, at every moment, at every second. We live with the consequences of these things as spiritual beings, and I'm very, very aware of that. So I welcome everyone who comes in, and we, again, as you said, collaboratively create community and ritual that is meaningful and transformational, we hope, for those who participate in it, but also for the individuals who commit themselves to a path of study with me and in community. This is something that is iterative and involves a lot of constant self-reflection, and is in and of itself an evolving, situation. But I do take a lot of responsibility for, how that work is going, and it's a struggle. Spiritual leadership, visionary leadership of any kind is a constant, a constant process. So yeah, it's a good question.
And then in that process of carefully and responsibly, but evolving and creating new ways of approaching these things, as well as holding on or crafting a vehicle for continuing the old. How does your pagan experience inform that? How does your background and your sense of what is dynamic and best about neo-paganism inform this Western Shakta Tantra that you're elaborating?
Well, I think that a lot of what my background in the craft allowed me to do was bring my creativity into the mix. I think that there is a lot of creativity, a lot of ways of understanding symbols, of putting together ritual, creating sacred space, holding space, utilizing the tools of Tantra that I've learned in a way and making them accessible to people. How do I do that? Well, I often do that through, indeed what I learned in the craft as a practicing witch. So it's definitely a foundational component of what we do in community. It has to be, yeah.
And I'm also really curious about what was the connection with your grandmother. I mean, it's always marvelous to come across people who did have some sort of current path to them through their family that was not typical Christian or Jewish, and something that had a deeper pagan sort of source to it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to. I certainly honor my grandmother in doing so, and I feel blessed and a lot of gratitude for having had that in my background. My grandmother was a witch and called herself such. In fact, in the opening, I think you mentioned something about my being Wiccan. I've never been Wiccan. I certainly have practiced with Wiccans and understand that path, but I've never been initiated nor self-initiated as a Wiccan. I have always called myself a witch when I chose to take that name for myself at the age of 16, but it's from my grandmother. My grandmother was someone who absolutely lived in touch with the subtle body and the psychic realm, was somebody who validated my dreams, who absolutely brought into, my life a sense of wonder at the unseen, and whether it was knowing things in advance, or there's a funny story of my grandmother absolutely knowing that even though I wasn't due to be born yet, I was born 3 months early. My mother was in labor and she had to leave this important dinner function that she and her husband were at. Things like that, growing up with those stories, and having them happen. My grandmother knew things that nobody else knew. Being in that kind of environment absolutely shaped my worldview, and again, I'm deeply grateful for it.
Well, it's remarkable that she self-identified as a witch. I mean, in that era, that was a very outlandish thing to do. Was she herself connected with her relatives, or did she kind of emerge out of the...
No. My grandmother certainly did a lot of reading and spent time as a Rosicrucian, was very much enamored of the British witch Sybil Leek, if you know about her. So it sort of got herself much more into the contemporary vein of things, which was still radical at that time. But no, she grew up very much in touch with, you could say, the old religion, the old ways. My grandmother and her family came from the Carpathian mountain region of Western Ukraine, and very much followed ancient practices that probably go back to the Neolithic, for all we know. And a lot of that still just sort of ran in her veins, and that's what I was gifted with as a young girl.
And isn't that part of the call, both in these very underground and somewhat fragmented Western streams, and then in some ways in more vibrant or established ways in the East, even if they are also seen as heterodox, but there's been a lot of it for a long time, that there's something about connecting with forces that are very, very old. I mean, you mentioned going back to the Neolithic. I mean, it seems that part of the force and the call that many people hear is not just to a spiritual reality or a God form or a source of inspiration, but it's to something that ties in with an element of reality of our experience that goes back before civilization, before all this mess that we're in even started. Do you have a sense of that, of tapping into something very, very old?
I think at times I do. I think there are many different ways I could answer your question. At times in ceremony or in meditations, there's certainly a timelessness that happens that I can say is ancient and feel as ancient. There are times when I'm in India and I'm sitting at a tree that's been worshipped at for thousands of years when I feel like, this is ancient. There's a deep, deep vein of worship and devotion and reverence for earth and life that goes back beyond recorded history. There are those times for sure. In terms of actively engaging that, I think that it's not something that I do sort of from a archaeomythological perspective, which is certainly one perspective academically that I could follow. But I think it's more in the sense of at times being a woman, being a mother, and having that lineage, but then also having the lineage of the kaula into which I'm initiated, and feeling that sort of as a constant, and knowing that goes back across the ages, across time, unbroken. So in those ways, I feel the ancientness and the truth and the vitality and the substance and depth of what it is that we're evolving.
How do you feel that Kali speaks differently to or at least in the contemporary milieu that you work with in the West, how Kali speaks differently to men and women?
I don't know that she speaks differently to men and women. I'm sure there are ways in which she does. I'm sure that there are ways in which she might speak to or inspire someone who's of another gender. I think that really her call gets beyond gender. I mean, that was my experience. I know that the things that led me to a place before my dream to need the awakening that the dream occasioned, were culturally infused, and there were gender overlays. And as a woman, I sort of suffered in a particular way. And that led to a psychospiritual reality. I had the dream. Kali came and sort of helped me get out of that. Sure, that was gender infused, but her call was really to a soul level of awakening. And I think she was sort of saying, do you live or, do you want to die? And if you choose life, live it a different way, and you figure out how to deal with it in a woman's body here and now, right? And I think that from all of the people that I know, with all of their stories, that's essentially what she says. It's a call to the individual soul. And then she liberates the soul in this day and age and form into whatever expression it wants. I don't know, therefore, that she has a particular way of coming to men or women that's different, but I think that she does allow us to open to whatever that deeper inner potential is, regardless of body or gender or class or race or whatever. I mean, that's why she could come to me, like I said, in New York. She didn't say, I'm outside of India, I'm not going to go, And my dissertation and other people's stories and work is out there, describing the countless ways in which she's come to people of all backgrounds and traditions and upbringings.
Oh, so that's part of what you've been kind of tracking in some ways, is how she sort of emerged within people's lives when they didn't necessarily expect it, or it was not what they thought was coming.
Yes.
There's something powerful about these images, however you want to think about the ultimate reality of these gods, but there's a kind of animated quality that is unpredictable in terms of what strikes people's lives, whether they're dreams, whether images, whether books they read. And so you've been sort of tracking that to some degree.
Yeah, I have, and I think that the dark goddesses, be they Kali or the Black Madonna or any of the other forms in which she arises, come to us when we're ready to have that kind of shattering we spoke of at the beginning of this interview. If our soul is crying out to be heard, and we are, and our culture is, and anything else out in the world is sort of preventing us or stopping us, or our own, psychological repression, internalized oppression is stopping us, then she comes, and she helps to liberate us. And it's a very sort of dicey tightrope, if you will, because we could kind of fall either way, and that is definitely very much in line with tantric teaching. The road can be hard and fast. Are you willing to commit and dedicate yourself to, living an authentic life? In essence, that's the question. But it really gets to the heart, to the core of who we are, and it is very, very challenging.
Indeed. Well, I think there's challenges pretty much any way you look right now, and it's amazing how even the more surface aspects of the dark goddess figure, the more frightening imagery, etc., begins to make more sense the more that we look at how rapidly and how difficultly the world is changing right now, where what might have seemed before like a sort of outlandishly frightening figure seems more almost in consort with the time. And so that's one of the reasons, again, as I said, that I've always been I've been very interested in tracking particularly Kali, but also other dark goddesses and gods in terms of how they speak to our challenges now, because our challenges are it's seemingly intensifying. We have about just 30 seconds left. I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to tell people that they can find out more information about Sharanya by going to Sharanya.org. And if you're in the Bay Area and you're lucky, you can check out a Kali Puja. And anything else that you're working on that you would like to let people know about, Chandra?
Or come to our Yoni Puja on the 20th. We'd be welcome. We would absolutely have open arms and welcome you. And yes, join us online if you're not in the Bay Area through Kali Vidya, our wisdom school. I do in collaboration with community online teaching, Kali Vidya, KaliVidya.org.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Chandra. This is Erik Davis. You've been listening to Expanding Mind, and keep your mind open.